Hello, I'm Kurt Owen. I'm coming to you today from Torrington, Wyoming. We've been up here donating some time, training some police officers. Always remember to support your first responders and pray for them, because they're the ones that are going to show up when trouble happens. And you want them to know that you care about them and that you are supporting them with your prayers. We've been talking about the importance of the local church. And last time we talked about how where you go to church is the difference between life and death. Now, it is certainly true that you don't have to go to church in order to be a Christian. But in order to fulfill the perfection in which God created you to walk in your Christian walk, you do have to attend church, because there's a lot of scriptures you can't fulfill unless you actually show up there. And I don't say that because I'm a pastor. I say that just simply because the word's true. Now, where you go to church, we saw where a woman actually is in a wrong church, and because of that she stays bowed over for 18 years. And then when she finally gets free, the pastor of the church is extremely angry that she got free, and he begins to invoke his religion. And Jesus did not take very well to that. But, a lot of times, so you need to know that the place that you're going is encouraging you to believe, not encouraging you not to believe. And they're not going to be upset when God begins to do things in your life. But there's more to it than that. And, this is something that I've seen, really as I travel around the world. When people start looking for churches, it seems like they're trying to find the wrong things when they're going to church. Now, I want you to think about this. A lot of times in fact, it just happened recently. Somebody said to me, they said, well, this is where we go to church because we love the worship experience. The teaching is okay, but man, the worship is awesome. And then the other thing that I hear a lot is, well, we go there because they have a great children's ministry, and it's not really that important that I get fed. It's really more important that my children get fed. And I really want to address both of those things, but I want to look at Jesus' ministry and what he did. Now, I'm here in Matthew chapter 9, and I'm in verse 35. It says, "Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues," their churches, "preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people." So when Jesus went to church, there was three things he sought to accomplish. There was the teaching of the word, there was the preaching of the gospel, and then there was the healing of the sick. So this is what Jesus thought church ought to be about. Now, this is not the only time the Bible uses this vernacular. In fact, Matthew uses it twice, almost verbatim, and then it's used other places. So when Jesus showed up at church, he thought that there ought to be teaching. You needed to receive teaching. Now, also there was the preaching of the gospel. Now, think about preaching in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways that you can relate to it is it's something that inspires you. You're being told what's available. Now, you can be told what's available, but you still got to learn to walk in it. So think of it this way. It's kind of like, the preaching is kind of like the infomercial. This is what is possible. This is what is available. And then the teaching comes along and says, okay, what's available, this is how you walk in it. But then there ought to be demonstrations of it. That's the reason for the healing. Now, going back again to what I've been hearing a lot about lately. Now listen, I am a worshiper. I believe in worshiping God. I spend the early parts of my day worshiping God. But here's the thing, that's not how you choose a church. Because if you go to some of these churches that have some of the best worship experiences possible, see what happens to the people on Monday. See about how immature they are. See about how those people, and it's funny, they love to worship when there's a lot of music playing, but then when there's no music playing, or they're having a problem and you start talking, why don't you worship? I just don't feel like it. Why? Because the music's not playing, because they're led by their feelings. You meet a true worshiper. One of our board members, his name is Jim Bergdorf. Now, Jim is a true worshiper. In fact, if you've never read his books on worship, you really should, because they're very eye-opening and they'll change your life. But one of the things I like about Jim is Jim will worship when there is no music. Jim will worship when all hell breaks loose. And he will actually release his faith in his worship. But if you go to a church for the worship, but then there's not any real teaching. Teaching is how Jesus deals with unbelief. This is how he teaches people to keep people steady. Do you remember here in, let's look in Mark chapter 6 right quick. And I know this is controversial, and I know I'm going to make some of you mad. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that I'm not saying that I don't believe in worship. I'm saying that people have taken it out as priority. You want that feeling that you get in that service, but that's something you should be able to have on your own between you and the Lord. And if it's not in a service, it's not the end of the world, as long as you are getting taught something. Now, ideally, we'd like to have both, wouldn't we? We'd like to have a great worship experience, but I don't go into a church evaluating the church on the basis of their worship. I first look at their teaching. Now, this is in Mark chapter 2, and when Jesus is rejected in his own hometown, and we get down to verse 5, it says, "Now he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people. And he marveled because of his unbelief, and he went about the villages in a circuit teaching." In other words, what he was doing was he just kept going around again. He'd come by on a regular basis, teaching a little bit more and teaching a little bit more. It doesn't say that he went around worshiping. In fact, when it talks about what he did in the synagogues, worship isn't even mentioned. Now, I believe we should worship, but I believe that worship is an intimate thing between you and the Father and is not necessarily an indicator of church. This kind of goes along with children's ministry. Come on, guys. The church is not there to raise your kids. The church is there to teach you and encourage you in how to raise your kids. It's there to show your kids what's in the Word. But ultimately, you need to be in a church that's teaching you something, even if they have absolutely no children's ministry. That children's ministry can take place in your home when you, the father and mother, sit down with your children and teach your children the Word of God. And when they have a problem, you know what scriptures to reference and to teach them how to walk in that. This is so important because you are such a strong witness in the life of your child. Now again, I'm all for worship. I'm all for children's ministry. I believe that children's ministry should not be a babysitting service, but actually teach your children. But if you are not being taught in the main service, if you are not receiving encouragement and strength and the Word being placed down on the inside of you, there's a problem, because then your children, even though they might be hearing the Word, they're not going to see you living out the Word in your everyday life. Why? Because you don't know it and you don't know how to apply it. This is so very, very important. Now again, I think we ought to have a strong main service. I think we ought to have a strong children's service. I think we ought to have a strong worship. But if I'm looking for a church, I want somebody that's going to do what Jesus did when he showed up to church. Preaches the gospel, teaches, and then heals the sick. I'm looking. I want to see where people are being healed. Now, we're going to be taught more and more about how to choose a local church. We're going to be talking about the importance of church. But guys, put the priority on the right things. Listen, if you learn the Word, you'll have something to worship about. I see a lot of people, one of the reasons that they have such trouble on Monday morning after a great worship service on Sunday is because they have no idea what to worship about, because they're still consumed by the problem and their unbelief is eating their lunch. And what did Jesus do when he saw unbelief so much so that he marveled about? He went on a circuit teaching, not worshiping, teaching, because that teaching of the Word will change your life forever. I love you very, very much. The family of Kurt Owen Ministries is praying for you and standing with you. And again, I'm not against worship, but I'm against it being outside of its place. And I'll tell you this, when you learn the Word and learn what Jesus has purchased for you, you will worship more in spirit and truth than you ever have before. Love you very much. We'll talk about this again next time. And remember, Jesus is risen and victory is assured.